Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're really going deep into the world of OCD, but we're going beyond what you usually see, on the surface. We're looking at a model. It's called the vulnerable self model, and it gets to how we see ourselves. That's a huge part of this condition, this OCD thing that so many people misunderstand. It's not just about, needing everything to be perfect on your desk or anything like that.
Right.
It goes way deeper.
Yeah, it really does. It goes much deeper than those outward behaviors.
Right?
It's about intrusive thoughts. It's about the anxieties, the compulsions, and those can feel impossible to resist sometimes.
Absolutely. And to guide us through this, we've got some excerpts from Notes, OCD.pdf.
Okay.
And I'm very excited to unpack all of this with you.
It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
This model really kind of changes how we think about OCD.
Yeah.
Because it shows us that it's not just about the things we see. It's not just about the behaviors. It's about how somebody sees themselves deep down, like they're flawed or vulnerable in some way.
So it's not like, oh, I need things to be just so. It's, I'm afraid of becoming, ...
Yes, exactly. And that fear is like the fuel that drives everything.
Right.
The source material has this great example. It's about a guy named John, and he's constantly cleaning, like obsessively cleaning his house.
Yeah.
And he's terrified. He's terrified of becoming like his dad, who was really untidy. But here's the thing. There's no evidence that he's actually like that.
Oh, wow.
It's almost like this phantom version of himself.
Right.
Like the OCD self that he's trying to run from, desperately.
So he's battling this like imagined idea of who he might be based on a potentially very wrong self-perception.
Yes.
Okay, so then the compulsions, take John's cleaning.
Right.
Those come in as like a way to neutralize that threat.
Exactly. But here's where it gets tricky.
Okay.
Those compulsions, they give you some relief in the moment.
Right.
But they actually end up making things worse in the long run.
So how does that work? Like, how does that cycle even make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Because if cleaning makes John feel better,
Right.
why is it ultimately hurting him?
Because what it's doing is it's making him believe that the threat is real.
Right.
So every time he gives in and does that compulsion, he's like proving to himself,
oh, I see,
that I need to keep doing this or I'll become that messy person. And the relief he gets, it's almost like a reward. And it just strengthens that link between his fear and what he's doing to feel better.
His brain is learning the wrong thing.
Yes, exactly.
Instead of learning that the mess is not a real threat, it's learning that cleaning is the only way to, like, stay safe.
That's exactly it.
And that's a sneaky little trap.
It is. It's a sneaky trap.
So that's why this model is so important, because it helps us to see OCD.
Right.
Not as just a bunch of weird behaviors, but as this struggle with how you see yourself, right?
Absolutely. It gets to the why.
Yes.
Behind all the stuff we see on the outside.
This is making me think about cognitive appraisals. We've talked about that before.
Right.
How did that fit into all of this model?
Cognitive appraisals, that's how people with OCD make sense of those thoughts, the intrusive ones.
Okay.
Let's say someone has this thought about harming someone they love.
Right.
Most people would be like, ugh, weird thought, gone.
Yeah, exactly.
But for someone with OCD and with this vulnerable self-idea, it becomes a huge threat.
Right.
A massive threat.
Because it lines up with that fear of becoming that person, right?
Exactly.
Maybe I am a monster kind of thing.
Right. Like, if I'm thinking these thoughts, what does that say about me?
Right.
Maybe my fears are true.
So it makes those thoughts so much scarier.
Yes.
You can't just brush them off.
Exactly.
That's just a thought. It's like...
It's evidence.
Evidence.
Yeah.
Wow. And that makes the compulsions so strong, right?
Exactly.
Because it's like,
It's a way to get back in control, to prove that they're not that thing that they're so scared of.
This is really eye-opening. This model really connects a lot of dots.
Yeah, I think so too.
I'm really glad we're talking about
I
this.
see too. It's important.
So, the source material talks about 5 key points about this whole vulnerable self thing.
Right.
I'm really curious to dig into those.
Yeah.
To see how they kind of fit into this picture that we started painting.
Absolutely. Those 5 points are really important.
Yeah.
They show how that fear of becoming the OCD self, all that self-doubt, it's the engine driving those obsessions, the compulsions.
Right.
But the biggest thing they tell us is that this OCD self,
yeah,
it's kind of an illusion.
Really?
It's built on faulty reasoning.
Wait. So you're saying this whole thing
Yeah.
might be based on like a false idea?
In a way, yeah. The source material talks about how people with OCD, they often use things that are irrelevant
Oh, wow.
or out of context to justify those fears. It's like they take one little bit of information and build this whole story,
Right.
ignoring all the other stuff that doesn't fit.
So John, for example,
Right.
it's not just that his dad was messy.
Right.
He's taken that one fact and he's made this whole narrative about, like, I'm destined to be like that.
Yes.
But there's no reason, logically, to believe that that's true.
Yeah, it's like they're looking at themselves
Right.
through this warped lens.
Wow.
So recognizing that and then challenging it, that's a big part of breaking free.
Okay, so that's where therapy comes in, right?
Exactly.
But before we go there, you said the OCD self might be an illusion.
Right.
What does that mean for someone's true self? Can they even find that again?
That's a great question, and we'll dig into that more
Okay.
when we talk about therapy. But we have to remember, even if the OCD self isn't real,
Yeah,
the suffering it causes, that's very real.
absolutely.
So support and the right treatment, those are really important.
Of course. But I mean, just knowing that this thing you're afraid of
Right.
might not even be real. That has to be
It can be.
hopeful.
It can be very hopeful. It could be that first step
Right.
to breaking free.
Wow. This is a lot to think about.
It is.
And I think we should let that kind of sink in a little bit before we move on.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Welcome back. Glad to be continuing this deep dive with you.
Yeah, I'm excited to dig into those therapeutic approaches we mentioned before.
Wow.
The cognitive restructuring, the exposure and response prevention, self-compassion. They all seem like different ways of tackling this, right?
Yeah. Each one kind of focuses on a different part of that OCD cycle.
Right.
And they can work together like a combo for treatment.
Okay.
So let's start with cognitive restructuring.
Right.
The goal with this one is to help people with OCD to really challenge those thoughts, those beliefs that are causing all the anxiety.
Okay. So like those distorted thoughts we talked about,
Exactly.
you're basically giving it a reality check.
Yeah. But that's easier said than done.
Right, I can imagine.
Changing those deep beliefs about yourself, that's tough.
Yeah.
But it can really make a difference. Like, imagine working with someone who's scared of contamination.
Okay.
They might believe that if they touch a doorknob, boom, they're going to get sick.
Right, and then they start doing all the cleaning and stuff too.
Exactly. The compulsions come in
Right.
to try and neutralize that threat. So with
Yeah.
cognitive restructuring, the therapist would be like, okay, let's look at the evidence. How many times have you actually gotten sick from a doorknob?
Right.
How often do people really get sick that way? Are there other things, like a virus going around, that might be the real culprit?
So it's helping them see that thoughts aren't always true?
Exactly. They're interpretations. And those can be wrong.
Right.
And once they start to question those old beliefs,
Yeah.
they can come up with new ones.
Right.
Ones that are more balanced. So instead of thinking, I'll get sick, it's like, well, probably not. And even if I do, I can handle it.
It's like they're learning to talk back to that inner voice.
Yeah, that critical voice.
Yeah. The one that's always like, danger, danger.
Right. It's about taking back control, not letting those thoughts run the show.
And that's where the vulnerable self model helps, right?
Absolutely. It helps us pinpoint the exact fears, the self-perceptions that are driving all those thoughts.
So you're not just challenging any negative thought.
Right.
You're going for the ones that come from that idea of being flawed.
Right, exactly. It's way more targeted.
Okay, so cognitive restructuring is changing how you think. What about exposure and response prevention? That's more about facing the fear head on.
It is, and it can be tough,
Yeah.
but also it can be so freeing. The idea is that if you keep avoiding the things that trigger your OCD,
Right.
you're basically telling yourself, yep, those things are dangerous.
So you got to break that cycle.
Exactly. You got to learn that those feared outcomes, they're not the end of the world.
Okay.
So with ERP, the therapist would help someone gradually face those situations, those thoughts that trigger their OCD, but in a safe way, a controlled way. And the important part, they can't do their compulsions.
Oh, so like in the contamination example, they touch the doorknob
Right.
and then they don't wash their hands right away.
Exactly. They have to sit with that anxiety, that urge to clean, and realize they can handle it without the compulsion.
So they're kind of testing out their fears?
Yeah, like a controlled experiment.
Wow. I bet that's empowering, but also really scary.
It can be, especially in the beginning.
Yeah.
But the therapist is there to help every step of the way. They start small with things that aren't as scary
Okay.
and slowly work their way up.
Like building up their tolerance.
Exactly, and their confidence.
Okay.
And as they start to have these successes,
Yeah.
they start to see that they can handle the anxiety without doing the compulsions, their brain starts to change.
That rewiring thing, right.
Yeah, they're learning that those feared outcomes, they're not actually dangerous.
And then they don't need the compulsions as much.
Exactly. But the vulnerable self model is important here too.
How so?
Because you're not just exposing them to any old fear.
Right.
You're going after the fears that are tied to that messed up sense of self.
Oh, okay.
So for John, it might mean making a mess on purpose.
Oh, wow.
Like leaving dishes or letting his desk get cluttered
Okay.
to show him that he's not inherently messy and that a little mess won't ruin his life.
It's not just about changing what you do, but why you do it.
Yes.
Exactly.
Okay, last one. Self-compassion. This one seems so different.
It is, yeah.
It's not about fighting your thoughts. It's about being nice to yourself.
Exactly. It's realizing that you're human, that everyone makes mistakes, has weird thoughts.
Right.
It's okay to not be perfect.
And that's going to be hard for people with OCD, right?
It is. They're already struggling with this idea that they're flawed,
Yeah.
and then the intrusive thoughts just pile on top of that.
Like a double whammy.
Yeah. Yeah. But with self-compassion, they can learn to treat themselves like they would treat a friend.
Right.
With kindness, with understanding.
So instead of like beating themselves up for having those thoughts.
Right. They're like, hey, it's just a thought. It doesn't mean I'm a bad person.
Exactly. It's about creating this safe space inside themselves
Okay.
where they can acknowledge the struggle without judgment.
And again, the vulnerable self model ties into this.
It does, because it highlights that core belief of being flawed.
Right.
So self-compassion is like the opposite of that.
Yeah.
It's like saying, no, I'm not flawed. I deserve love, even with my OCD. You got it.
It's about like accepting yourself completely.
Yes. It's not ignoring the problem. It's about learning to hold the pain and the love,
Wow, I love that.
the struggle and the acceptance all at the same time.
So we've got these three approaches: cognitive restructuring, ERP, and self-compassion. They all work on different levels to help people find freedom from that OCD cycle.
Right. And they often work together.
Okay.
Like self-compassion can make it easier to do ERP
How so?
because it takes away some of the fear of failing, the shame about those intrusive thoughts.
And cognitive restructuring can help with the self-criticism that makes self-compassion hard.
Exactly. They all fit together.
It's like a team effort.
Yeah, like pieces of a puzzle.
Wow, this has been so insightful.
And
We've really broken down this vulnerable self model and how it can help with treatment.
it's not just about managing symptoms. It's about getting to the root of the problem.
It's about reclaiming yourself, right?
Exactly. Your true self, the self that's beyond the OCD.
Speaking of which, I'm curious about that process, of reclaiming yourself. Can you ever really break free from those thought patterns, those behaviors? Or is it more about learning to live with OCD?
That's a great question, and one we'll explore in our final part.
Okay.
We'll talk about the nuances of living with OCD
Right.
and how self-discovery and growth can play a role in recovery. But for now, let's just take a moment to let all this sink in and appreciate how much this vulnerable self-model can help us understand and approach OCD in a whole new light.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the vulnerable self and OCD.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? Exploring this model and how it shines a light on, well, how OCD really works.
It really has. We've moved past just listing off symptoms. We've really tried to grasp how much OCD is tied to how someone sees themselves, their self-perception.
It's not just about, oh, I like things neat. It's about, I'm terrified of becoming messy, right? Or whatever that specific OCD theme is for someone.
Yeah, or it's not just, I check the stove a lot. It's, what if I become the irresponsible one? What if I cause harm because I wasn't careful enough?
Exactly. And we talked about how those compulsions, they give you a little break, a little relief.
Right.
But in the end, they actually make that feared self-identity stronger. It's like a trap.
A sneaky one.
Yeah.
But understanding the vulnerable self model, that gives us a map, doesn't it?
It does.
It's a way to approach treatment that goes right for those core fears,
Yeah.
not just the stuff we see on the outside.
Absolutely. We talked about cognitive restructuring, challenging those thoughts that aren't really true. We looked at exposure and response prevention, learning to handle the anxiety without giving in. And of course, we can't forget self-compassion, being kind to yourself even when things are tough.
Yeah, it's like we built this toolkit.
We have.
With different tools to chip away at, the control that OCD has over someone's life. But before we wrap things up, there's something we haven't touched on yet. those different types of OCD, I have a feeling it's not like one size fits all, is it?
You're right, it's not. OCD has some core features, the thoughts, the compulsions, those are consistent.
Right.
But the themes, they can be so different. We talked about contamination OCD,
The
right?
fear of germs, all the cleaning, the avoiding stuff.
Right, and then there's checking OCD, the fear that something bad's gonna happen, so you gotta check and check and check again.
But there are more, aren't there?
Oh yeah, there are more. There's symmetry and ordering OCD. It's more than just liking things to be tidy. It's this intense need for things to be a certain way, and the anxiety's overwhelming if it's not right.
Then there's hoarding OCD, the trouble with letting go of things. And that's not just clutter, right? It's often tied to feelings, fears of waste, fears of loss.
Exactly. And remember scrupulosity? We touched on that a bit earlier.
Right, right. The one with the religious and moral worries.
Yes. Those thoughts, the compulsions, they're all around sinning, violating beliefs, even doubting your faith. It's especially hard because it hits those deep personal values.
It's really amazing how many sides OCD has.
It is.
And I imagine those types can overlap too, which makes things even more complicated.
Oh, absolutely. Someone might experience symptoms from several types. That's why seeing a professional is so important.
Right, to get the right diagnosis and the right help.
Exactly.
Thinking about these types, it adds another layer to this vulnerable self idea, doesn't it?
It does. It's like each type is a different side of that feared self.
So with contamination OCD, it's not just the germs, it's about being unclean on a deeper level, right?
Right, like you're somehow bad or wrong.
And with checking, it's not just about locking the door, it's about that fear of becoming the careless one, the one who messes up.
You got it. This model really helps us understand how heavy those thoughts are for someone with OCD.
It's not just in their head, it's really personal and real to them.
It is.
Listening to all of this, I have to acknowledge that it might be tough for some people out there listening.
Oh, yeah, of course.
OCD can be a really hard topic.
It can.
And this might have brought up some feelings, maybe even triggered some of those intrusive thoughts.
It's important to be aware of that. If this deep dive has stirred things up for you, it's okay to feel that. It's normal.
It's a normal reaction to something that touches such a sensitive part of ourselves.
It is. And if it's too much, if you're feeling overwhelmed, please reach out. Talk to someone you trust, a friend, family, or a therapist.
Absolutely. The International OCD Foundation, they're amazing. They have a ton of information on their website, and they can connect you with support.
There is hope out there. You're not alone in this. There are people who get it, who want to help you find recovery.
That's so important to remember. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I want them to remember that knowledge is powerful, especially when it comes to mental health. The more you know about OCD, the more you can fight back and live your life. You are not defined by your OCD. You are a whole person. You have strengths, talents, things you love. Don't let OCD steal your joy.
That is a powerful message to end on. Until next time, everyone, stay curious, stay informed, and be kind to yourselves.